Hello, everybody, and welcome here to the Wine with Jimmy channel. Thank you so much for visiting and clicking by. This is all about wine education here. We go into introductory videos all the way to quite in-depth videos to help those of you studying the world of wine. Certainly, what this video is about is to help those of you studying your diploma of the WSET. This is a D1 update sections. The specific topic here is regenerative viticulture. Let's get into our second video on regenerative viticulture. It's our first major topic, and that is agroecology. So you'll see the Chateau Giscourt Bordeaux producer there who has substantially invested in agroecology. So this is our video 2. Part 1 and 2 are available as free content, but parts 3 onwards are only available to those of you who subscribe to my e-learning platform. You'll find information about that at the bottom of every slide and also at the description section below this video. Lots of exclusive video content over there to help you with your studies. And if you just want to learn a lot more about wine, you may find a subscription to the level 3 or level 4 actually very fascinating for you. Let's start to talk about the world of agroecology as a part of regenerative viticulture. So here we go. So there's a bit of a slide here which comes from Crop Life International, which is talking about agriculture, viticulture being an aspect of that. So this is the study of the relation of agricultural crops, viticulture, and the environment. So going through the land, production, and understanding water, so soil, production, water, and then enabling people and institutions with ideas and information about this, research, and so on. So with viticulture, regenerative grape growers view their vineyards as agroecosystems, or sometimes we would just say an ecosystem, which have been modified for agriculture. So this shift in perspective will encourage grape growers to create functioning ecosystems. Very important that it works, the ecosystem, and that's rather than a system that only meets the need for one crop, such as a monoculture. So you have some land. The traditional way of doing this is having some land, you've got one crop from it, and you go to every length possible to get one crop from that land. And that means, of course, eradicating diversity, applying chemicals into the soils, and so on. And this is not completely ubiquitous. We do have other forms of viticulture as well, but this is certainly how many vineyards are farmed today. So we're talking about a shift away from that and thinking about an agroecosystem which is fully functioning. So the system's needs are naturally met. So inputs from outside, such as fertilizers and synthetics, are reduced significantly. So that's thinking about how we can make up for perhaps a deficiency within the soil or the ecosystem at large by thinking about what we can do within that ecosystem more naturally. So things like cover cropping, for example. So quite important. Now let's talk about that first sort of pillar out of that, the reduction in external inputs. So something outside of the land being brought in from industry or factory, for example. So let's talk a little bit about that. So we're talking here about, first of all, the understanding that really in vineyards going way back when, all the way to ancient times, it's more likely that vineyards were a part of a wider ecosystem functioning ecosystem where there are multiple crops being produced from one area of land. Often we call this polyculture or permaculture. So where you have multiple products coming from one area of land. But with the rise of more commercial wine being produced, certainly in the late 19th century, 20th century, and with industrialization and the creation of mechanization like tractors, for example, we have much more manicured, strategically laid out vineyards where it is only the crop from that area of land. And we call that monoculture. Okay. And in order for monoculture, for a vineyard to function, it's going to need a lot of external inputs because there is very little ecosystem around the vine in that locality. So agroecology aims to create more diverse and stable ecosystems by farming more naturally, thinking about more kind of very traditional to ancient methods. Okay, so bringing in typically more polyculture to reduce the amount of external inputs. And that's to create a healthy and thriving vineyard, whilst, of course, delivering a reliable crop. I mean, we don't just want to have grand ideas of having old school methods, but we don't think about producing a crop. We need crop levels for commercial wines as much as, of course, high-end, niche wines and so on. There's a quite classic picture of monoculture in South Australia, well sort of manicured vineyard. You'll see that there's not much life within the soil or the land around it there. We don't see any forests. It's just a fairly large production of monoculture in that picture. Let's talk a little bit about biodiversity. So all of that modernization and industrialization in thinking about monoculture certainly has reduced biodiversity within vineyards, but also within farming as a whole. And this has led to problems of erosion, loss of soil structure and soil health, and also therefore an increased amount of pest pressure. Now we're going to talk about something called functional biodiversity. This is a more modern concept that allows farmers to understand the benefits of biodiversity in terms of managing their land. So giving them, let's say, a toolkit and knowledge in order to compete against issues and problems and pressure that may be building up in the vineyard, instead of just ordering chemicals and then blasting the vineyard of those chemicals. So putting that in more practical terms, that certainly would be like including the planting of hedges, hedgerows, woods and small wooded areas around the vineyards, sometimes inside them. And then also something which is very heavily discussed and has been for some time now, intercropping or cover cropping. And all of this would increase biodiversity and the attraction of natural predators of potential pest problems. Okay, so we call this functional biodiversity. The picture you see there are some hedge plantings at Château de Pouillon in Beaujolais, newly integrated into that vineyard site. Next, we will talk about ecological infrastructures, EI, or sometimes called ecological compensation zones, ECZs. Now, this is important to talk about because it's still building upon the premise of biodiversity. And I will relate this to the picture you see on your screen, which is in a production here of Matacache vineyards in the Borba of Alentejo, a proposal put forward for an agroecosystem vineyard from its inception and planting So the planning stage is in 2015, planting in 2017, and you'll see the design on the left-hand side, and then all of the descriptions there, including trees being planted, shrubbery, and also wet systems and orchards as well. So these ecological infrastructures or ecological compensation zones are areas of land near, or let's say adjacent to, the vineyard that can act as a habitat to increase functional biodiversity that we discussed on the last slide. It is accepted, certainly with sustainability and regenerative viticulture, that about 15% of an agricultural property should be devoted to an EI to maintain sufficient biodiversity within the local ecosystem. Now, there are three types. We have large permanent habitats. These are able to house beneficial organisms on a permanent basis. Number two is what we would call a bridge habitat, or sometimes a stepping stone habitat. They're not able to support permanent populations. They're not as large. And then a corridor, which act as a conduit between those two. Now, they should be, these habitats, be it large or smaller, no more than sort of 50 meters away from each other in order to have this kind of connectivity with biodiversity. So just to reiterate that picture there, Matakeish vineyard, planted actually eventually in 2017. The strategy of that vineyard was based on the type of soil as well as the biophysical infrastructure present in the landscape. And that meant that they worked very much at the planning to plant the correct biodiversity across the estate. So the aim really was to protect water, soil, vegetation, increase useful organisms against pests and diseases, and to increase biodiversity. So let's look at our next concept, talking about ecosystem services. So this terminology, ES, ecosystem services, basically is a terminology for the land, the agricultural land, doing the work that, say, a modern farmer would do today. So all of that kind of inputs coming in from outside of the farm, but the actual ecosystem is doing it. It's the services that it is doing. So the ecosystem, with the correct planning and knowledge, can act as a self-correcting mechanism, thus reducing the need for external inputs that we've discussed quite frequently, such as chemical spraying. Now, one example here would be the inclusion of green manures or cover cropping. So things like legumes, which are able to fix the nitrogen in the soil, thus lowering the need for fertilizer to be brought in from outside the system. The picture you see here is Granton Vineyard in southern Tasmania, showing father beans planted in alternate vineyard rows. The beans are slashed and raked under the vines to allow the biomass to break down over time and provide really very important nutrient into the vineyard, into the ecosystem, majorly nitrogen. A little bit on agroforestry. So this is something which is not as further explored as hedgerow habitat biodiversity within the vineyard. It's much more of a kind of a periphery effect, but there are people that are experimenting, a few of them, with trees being within vineyards, but of course that makes it structurally quite difficult. So Agroforestry is the idea of utilizing trees in vineyards for their benefits of biodiversity. Yes, we've discussed that already in terms of the last couple of slides, but the connectivity of intelligent plant systems as well. And this is really talking about the extensive root systems that trees can have and how they are connected to the mycorrhizal network, which I'll talk about in the soil health section. But also plants can increase shading, and in warmer climates, certainly with ample amounts of sun, this can lower temperatures. And also, these wooded areas can provide warmer microclimates in spring, which can reduce late spring frosts. So some real important benefits there. The ancient Roman system was called the arbusta, A-R-B-U-S-T-A, and they actually used trees for trellising, a practice still employed in some parts of Italy, but more famously in places like Bolivia. And also, before mechanization, European vineyards would have orchards, typically, around them, sometimes within them. Now, we talked about benefits there of forests being around, being within. Okay, why doesn't everybody do it? Well, there are some drawbacks, of course. There are negative impacts, such as too much shading. Certainly in cooler to moderate areas, this can be a problem. An overabsorption of water in some regions, and that means that you can have struggles with water with the vineyard. And then also some trees can exude certain compounds into the air and the local ecosystem, sometimes seen as a positive, but can be a large impact, such as the eucalyptus trees within South Australia, with great studies done about the impact of those trees if they are, say, 10 meters away compared to 100 compared to 1,000. There is significant increase in eucalyptol, which is the compound that you find from those trees within the wines. So that has to be really given careful considerations, certainly within planning your wine. And then a little bit on intercropping and cover cropping, of course. You'll already have probably some significant ideas about this process through your studies and certainly through your travels to sustainable, organic, and biodynamic estates. So this was once a significantly common practice, and it all but faded out due to the modernization of vineyards, and certainly with mechanization, access required by tractors, which made the work in vineyards much easier and financially more viable. So cover cropping would be defined as the introduction of other plants to help with soil structure, fertility, and to prevent erosion, specifically the likes of surface runoff, soil erosion. So this is a real key pillar of regenerative viticulture to avoid those bare soils, which will happen really with monoculture vineyards that are heavily impacted by external inputs and tractors and machinery. Those soils tend to look dead and void of life, like something from lunar moon's surface. And that's what we're avoiding here with agroecology. Let's go into that in a bit more detail. So higher levels of organic material in the soil, that's from healthier soils, will lead to multiple things. Better water storage certainly is one of them. Now, one of the biggest sort of critiques of using cover cropping is that you're going to have a competing effect with the root systems of the specific cover crop versus the vine. And there needs to be thought around this because it's certainly a valid concern and discussion around it because they can compete for nutrients and water. But if you do have healthier soils through the usage of cover cropping, there will be better water storage in more mid to long term. So this will actually offset this. There are also cover crops that could be sown and then will die off before the growing season of the vine. So that is certainly in strategic management of your intercropping. Cover cropping will also increase soil structure and will limit soil compaction by producing a lot of the sort of macropores that you find, and therefore better exchange through the soil. So this, if you do have soil compaction, that will lead to a reduction in water storage and increased soil surface runoff. Cover crops will also have plants and flowers and leaf foliage, which will give an increased biodiversity, which is important. And there generally, as you can see from your slide, are 3 types of cover crops that can be utilized. First of all, and this is bringing your green fingers into play, certainly if you have some horticultural experience and you maybe work in a vineyard, you will get this. But perennials, first of all, these are those that are planted and they last continuously. They are long-term, so therefore there is less soil disturbance because you are not replanting on an annual basis. These are the likes of grasses. Grass is not great for organic additions, but are good for soil, preventing soil erosion. And there are others like different types of clover that are perennial cover crops as well. Then there are annuals, or annual cover crops. These are replanted each year with mowing and tilling in used to feed them into the soil after its cycle every year. The likes you'll see on your slide here, mustard, and that's at Gunlak Bunchal in Sonoma, California. Daikon radish, quite famously used by Nudorf in the Murteri Valley in Nelson, New Zealand, but also fava beans, winter pea, purple vetch, and crimson clover, amongst others. And thirdly, self-seeding winter annuals. So these are planted once and then will reappear every year due to their self-seeding. There are certain grasses that you may use with this, like the Zorro fescue, for example. And some cover crops are also utilized to combat vigor. So in a place where you've got fairly vigorous soils, fairly healthy soils, and therefore the possibility of having large yields, you certainly can use cover crops to try and reduce that. And there has been success of that, certainly in New York State, in upstate New York State. So this is planting things like chicory, for example, to combat vigor in the vines. And of course, this has a lot of debate around it because they're actually stating that certain varieties in New York, it's not actually hugely different to have a difference in vigor. The vigor of, say, Cabernet Franc, for example, and the larger yields produced from it, there is very little difference of quality compared to lower vigor examples. So there's lots of discussions to be had around that as well. So that brings me to my conclusion here for about a 25-minute video on agroecology. Please do join me as we get really into the fungal kingdom when we look at mycorrhizal networks next in the soil health. And that's just because I'm a real fun guy. Sorry. So that I'm a father. So that's part 3 coming up, and that will only be accessible to those of you who do subscribe to my e-learning platform over at www.winewithjimmy.com. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you do have a comment or question, please do get in touch. You can leave your comment below this video. Make sure you click like and you click subscribe. I've been Jimmy Smith. Goodbye.